In this segment, I'm going to invite you to participate in a little self-assessment exercise that will help clarify some of the underlying assumptions you have about how the world works and how you influence other people. We'll call this the life story exercise. Now, the first piece is I'm going to ask you to write your life story in 400 words or less. Basically, 1 page and a half typewritten. If you haven't done that yet, please pause the program and take some time now to write your life story in 400 words or less. Now that you've completed your life story in 400 words or less, let me show you another example. This is taken from Jimmy Buffett's book, A Pirate Looks at 50, where he wrote his life story in 400 words or less. You can pause and read if you wish. I encourage you to buy his book and read it there. But you can see that within 2 pages of text, you can summarize, and you may notice some differences in the way you've written yours from the way he has written his. So once you've generated that piece of data, and I will say that when we do this in a self-assessment class over a 3-month period in a semester-long course, we won't put a restriction on it. We'll ask people to write their life story with no word limit. And right away you begin to learn something about people when you see that one person will write 100 pages single-spaced and the next person will write 10 pages double-spaced. Without even reading the content, you begin to get some insight into who these people are. So one of the issues we want to do, and this will help us become more practiced and skilled at recognizing other people's vibes, is to look for the patterns, to look for the habitual routines. And in Jimmy Buffett's case, we can look at his story and begin to see, simply by circling similar words, patterns that run down through. Now, this is what we will call inductive logic, not deductive logic. And by inductive logic, I mean we begin with the data and we generate hypotheses. Deduction is we have the hypothesis or the rule or the dogma or the law, and then we apply it to everything else. This is the way that many nonprofit organizations or many for-profit organizations function. I'm going to invite you to develop your inductive logic skills, because in the business world, in a leadership role, you're going to find yourself confronted with a variety of options, and you'll be collecting data from different sources: your personal network, from the accounting reports, from the news media, from newspapers, televisions, from consulting reports. And your job will be to make sense of all of that disparate data and the various pools from which it's generated, and then draw conclusions and make high-stakes decisions based on your insight. So this ability to see patterns in disparate data is an important managerial skill. Now, we've circled here some seemingly related words. Now the question would be, what name would you give to that pattern? Clearly it has something to do with music. We might name it loves music, or makes music, or wants to sell music. Finding the right label that fits each of the data points is a key element. But there's more than one in this one as well. Here's another pattern or habitual routine that seems to run through this person's life. And I don't know how you would name this. I invite you to practice labeling. It might be something like this. So I invite you to do this with your life story in 400 words or less, to identify the patterns that you see in your story, and then to label them. You might find 2 or 3 or 4. So pause the program now and take time to identify the patterns that you put in your story. If you haven't written your story by now, and you're already listening to this, of course you'll bias your data. So that's why we asked you to write it first before we talked about how we're going to analyze it. Now, you could ask, was Jimmy Buffett a success? And of course your answer will depend on your VABES. It'll depend on whether or not you are able to understand your assumptions about the way the world works and how you define success. If we take society's definition, well, we could say he's rich, he has a lot of money, he's famous, people line up for blocks to go to his concerts. I don't know the last time you went to work, people lined up for blocks and said, wow, Ahmed's coming, Ahmed's coming. May or may not happen. He's healthy, although he's had several breakups and back-togethers. He's now in a happy marriage. He's had varied experience, and perhaps this one is really important. He's doing something that he loves, regardless of the financial results, although he's been very successful, perhaps in large part because you can sense his energy and enthusiasm by doing what he loves to do. If you haven't seen any Jimmy Buffett concerts or music, I invite you to go to YouTube, search for him, and play some of it so you get a sense of who this person is. He's been very successful in business. He has a chain of restaurants. He has a chain of grocery store marketing items, branded according to one of the songs he sang, Margaritaville. And he's also a best-selling author, having sold more than 5 books, over 1 million copies each. Let me give you perhaps a more traditional story to compare with yours. Howard Schulz, the founder of Starbucks Coffee. He told a story to a large group of marketers meeting in San Francisco at one point about how his family lived in government housing. His father collected dirty diapers for his blue-collar job, one that he disliked. And one day when Howard was only 7 years old, his father was injured in this job, and Howard, as a young boy, came home to find his father in a full leg cast. The family had no health insurance. They had no means of supporting themselves other than the father's job. And he was deeply impressed with how much this disrupted the dignity of his family. So he decided, interestingly, at a very young age, that if he was ever in a position to influence others, he was not going to let this kind of an accident disrupt or destroy the dignity of the family as it had happened in his own history. So when Starbucks had 10 stores and 100 employees, Howard proposed to his board of directors that they would give all of their employees, including part-time people, the transitory from our previous segment, the opportunity to purchase stock options and to have comprehensive medical benefits. So if you had been on the board of Starbucks at the time with a fiduciary responsibility, what would have been your reaction? What would you have said to this? I mean, the usual answer is, we can't afford it, nobody else is doing it, it's too expensive, and why would you want to do that? His answer, of course, was, well, my father broke his leg, we didn't have any health benefits, and it really had a major negative impact on our family. So one of the lessons that we can learn from Howard Schulz is that you can take significant events in your life story, and if you have mined those events and consciously addressed what you learned from each of them, these are likely to shape your decisions in the business world as an adult. So I've said that leadership, in my view, is about managing energy, first in yourself and then in those around you. And if your life story is the source of your leadership energy, then the question would be, are you willing to use that story to influence others at a deeper level? Now, there are some reasons why people might not want to do this. One of them is what we might call barriers to level 3 communication. Some people identify a difference between the personal life and their professional life. I think we could extend this continuum to include private lives. So not everything that is personal is necessarily private, and not everything that's private is something that you would want to reveal to others. But maybe some of the personal things you might. So if we extended this to make a continuum, most senior people draw the line there. And they would argue that familiarity breeds contempt, that personal things have no place in business, and that you should keep an arm's length distance from your people so that you can make difficult decisions. But what Jimmy Buffett and Howard Schulz have done is move the line there, and they've become willing to share significant portions of their personal life with their public counterparts, whether it's an audience or employees and professionals in the same industry. So what this requires is, interesting, the ability to make a couple of translations. So if you think about an event, something happens. Remember our big head model, the REB model, in our discussion of why people behave the way they do. When there's an event, we react to it, we respond to it. Now, we may or may not be aware of our reaction, of the emotions that this event causes, and they are there. If we're aware of it, we may try to understand what we're feeling. So sometimes people will appear and they're red in the face, their jaws clenched, their hands are clenched, they're gritting their teeth, and you might say, calm down, calm down. And their response is, I am calm. Well, clearly that person is not self-aware about emotional. His EQ would be low. And there's a need, therefore, for that person, in order to be self-aware, to translate those emotions into conscious awareness, into conscious thought. Let's call that translation number 1. And then there's a need to find a way to express what one is thinking and feeling in visible behavior, into words and action. Let's call that translation number 2. So if you've ever been in a situation where you said, I know what I'm thinking, but I can't quite find the words for it, you've confronted the difficulty of translation number 2. Well, leadership is based in large part on language, on your ability to communicate. So in a leadership role, you need, I believe, to have this translation number 1 ability to be aware of what it is that's upsetting you or frustrating you, of the functionality of those assumptions, and then secondly, to be able to communicate in powerful ways your ideas and thoughts to others. So the language of leadership, I believe, needs to be clear, stimulating, respectful, and authentic. When I say clear, if you give a speech and the people, as they're coming out of the meeting, can't figure out what you were trying to say, well, that's a big problem. If they understood what you said, but a week later they've forgotten it, it wasn't memorable or stimulating, that's a problem. And the way I push aside Hitler and Stalin as admirable leaders, they were certainly effective, although they used a lot of intimidation and threat. So one could argue, since they didn't get so much voluntary response from many people, although they did from others, I argue that the leader should be respectful of his or her audience and respectful of their desires, of what they want, so that they can make the voluntary choice to respond. And then finally, if you're blowing smoke, if you're pretending, if you're acting, people will smell that and it won't work. So I encourage you to practice your language. Whether you practice in the shower, while you're driving in a car, learning to translate your thoughts into words. I frequently practice in the shower. When I was in high school, I stuttered badly and I couldn't put two words back to back. But over the years, I've practiced trying to communicate my thoughts, and it's much easier now than it was before. In our module on strategy, I asserted that a charter is a great way to help you clarify your language, to articulate what you're trying to get to others. Now, a research team at Stanford Business School published an article in the Harvard Business Review saying that 3,000 pages of transcripts showed our team that you do not have to be born with specific characteristics or traits to be a leader. Leadership emerges from your life story. Well, like Homer Simpson, I'm going like, yes, duh. Where else would it come from? Well, Nigel Nicholson at the London Business School suggests that in his book Executive Instinct, there may be a leadership gene. That is, that some people are driven to be in charge of organizations. It's a controversial point of view, and we still don't know the final answer on that. That said, this particular study suggests that leadership emerges from your life story, and I've asked you to write your life story in 400 words or less. Noel Tishy outlines a similar exercise in his book, The Leadership Engine. Well, you've written your story. Now the question is what to do with it. We've analyzed it one way. Saul Alinsky makes this point that experience doesn't necessarily lead to wisdom. He says, most people do not accumulate a body of experience. Rather, they go through life undergoing a series of happenings which pass through their systems undigested. Happenings become experiences, he says, when they are digested, when they are reflected on, related to general patterns, and then synthesized. In other words, incorporated into your life view. So the way that we could harvest your life's leadership lessons from your story of 400 words or less is first ask you to go through and include in column 1 of this table all of the key events, whether it was getting married or joining the army or getting a degree or changing jobs, whatever that might be. And then to rate each of those events in terms of their emotional impact on you. So +5 would be it was a wonderful event. +1 would be it was a so-so event, not particularly good. A -3 would be it was a bad event. A -5 would be it was a disastrous and it had a horrible impact on me. So if you rate, for example, one of my items was my parents' divorce when I was 12 years old. That was a -5 for me. And you go down through each of the events and simply assess how much was the emotional impact of each of these events on you. I don't know how many events you'll have. You might have 10, you might have 15, you might have 20 in your life thus far. So for example, then I would ask you to chart, once you finish this, to chart these like this. So this will be an emotional history, if you will, of your life. So this would be up to the present day. This would be the day you were born. And then in this case, each of these is a significant emotional event that you mentioned in your life story. And you chart those so that you can see what your emotional history looks like. Now, here's what mine looks like, for example. And you'll notice that many people's charts will look very differently. So over the years, I've seen a variety of patterns. Some of them start high and stay high. Some of them start low and stay low. Some trend up. some trend down, some like mine oscillate high and low. This is an interesting one. The first time I saw that pattern, I wondered what it was. The woman said, "Oh, that was my divorce. It was the best of times because I was so happy to get rid of that jerk. And it was a bad time. It was emotionally depressing and sad." And then later her life came back together and carried on. I'll explain this one a little later in our segment. So here's the point. Your story has created your level 3 assumptions about the way the world works. And those assumptions determine your leadership style. So the question would be, are you willing to use that story to influence others? So if you've developed your table and you've listed the key incidents here, I don't know how many you have, and you've rated them +5 to -5 as to their emotional impact on you in terms of happiness or sadness. And then, here's the key point, did you take out of each of those the lesson? What was the lesson you learned? So when Alinsky says many people gather a series of happenings that pass through their systems undigested, this exercise is inviting you to go back and write down what was lesson number 1 that you learned from event number 1. So in my case, I mentioned my parents got divorced. The lesson I took away was marriage is bad. And I successfully defended that assumption until I turned 30 and I met my now wife, Susan, who convinced me that getting married was a good thing. So do that for each of these, and you will have here a series of lessons, like Howard Schulz did, that you can draw on at any time to make a point, to illustrate a condition, to describe a principle. And because people remember stories, this will help your leadership efforts to become more provocative and influential. So in becoming a level 3 leader, you could target level 1 using level 1 techniques, rewards and punishments. You could spend your time and energy focusing on logic and rationale and data and analysis, and that's not bad. And if you really wanted to get people deeply committed to your cause or your purpose, I assert that level 3 leadership is more powerful and more long-lasting than the other 2 strategies. So when it comes to trying to convince people, the first question is, do you have a story to tell? Do you have a strategic story based on the analysis that you did from our earlier segment on strategic thinking? Do you have a charter for your organization that describes your sense of the mission of the organization, the vision that you see for it, the principles that you think they should follow, and your strategies for getting there? And have you done that personally? I would argue it's kind of hard to do it at this level or this level if you haven't done it for yourself. Will you live your whole life and die before you figure out what your purpose in life is? Or don't you care? But if you don't have a story to tell, what will be the impact on your followers? The odds are that when we think about our buy-in scale over here going from passion down to active resistance, if you don't have a story to tell, you're likely to influence people at the lower levels of this scale. In fact, if you use level 1 techniques, I would argue you're likely to get lower levels of influence. Level 2 techniques will probably give you mid-range of buy-in, and level 3 techniques, where you focus on clarity of purpose, of vision, of values, touching people in their heartstrings, not just in their heads, will likely to get you higher levels of buy-in. So I invite you to consider, as you think about influencing others, what proportion of level 1, level 2, and level 3 techniques do you use? And to the extent that you want to use level 3 techniques, mine your life story to find the lessons that you've learned, clarify those in your mind, and then be ready to tell those incidental stories, not the whole story, but what happened in 1994, what happened in 2006, what was the big event that occurred to you that caused you believe this? And people will bond with you, people will understand you, and most likely their buy-in for your efforts will go up.